Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And here's one, the band's been gone for a long time. It's the newest record from Fleet Foxes called Crack Up. You know, I'm a little surprised I have not gotten more requests for this album. Okay, there's a part of me that isn't that surprised. Indie folk always falls into a weird category when it comes to how much people actually want me to cover it, but Fleet Foxes, they're a fascinating case in their own right. For one, I wouldn't quite define them as straightforward folk music, given how much they pulled on sunny 60s pop, alternative country, and some of the hollower Celtic elements that enriched their vocal harmonies on their first two albums. And while some of the impressionistic lyrics could make for a complicated listening experience to really decode what they were trying to say, a lot of people were just content to let the words and the richly organic instrumentation just wash over them. From a star-making self-titled debut to the darker yet no less compelling Helplessness Blues that dropped a couple of years later. And yet, there's a part of me that feels like Fleet Foxes, they might have been forgotten a little bit by some of the indie press. Between the years between records and an increasingly quip hype cycle, even in the indie scene, to say nothing of the rise of their one-time drummer for the group Josh Tillman to dominance under the moniker of Father John Misty, it might have been easy for Fleet Foxes to just get forgotten by some people, especially given as their very earnest and very heartfelt brand of folk was later copied and co-opted ad nauseum in the early 2010s by far less complex or interesting groups. And yet, 6 years after Helplessness Blues, Fleet Foxes, they're back after an extended hiatus, minus Josh Tillman, and on a new label with their longest record to date. And if only to really soak in those harmonies, I really wanted to check this out. So what did I find on Crack Up? Okay, I've seen a few different responses to this album, for there is a common consensus that this is a more, well, let's say, difficult record to really decode and process. And those responses tend to split into two categories. Those who will praise it regardless and highlight how the complexity is just part of the point, is a more progressive evolution of Fleet Foxes, and those who will highlight that, yeah, sure, it's progressive, but that angle doesn't exactly translate to stronger, more insightful songs or progressions that have the same punch of Fleet Fox's earlier work. And for me, look, there's a grain of truth to both perspectives, because while I definitely don't think this record is bad by any stretch, it does pale in comparison to Helplessness Blues and especially that self-titled album. And I would make the argument that those progressive influence, they don't exactly elevate the album enough to make up for surrendering some strong hooks and more cohesive songwriting. And hell, when you start digging into the songwriting, it gets even worse than you might think. Now, I'm fully aware that was some loaded statements to begin this, and I do want to stress that, at least from the surface, Fleet Foxes do maintain many of the tones and sounds that made them such an easy group for me to really like. The vocal harmonies led by Robin Pecknold, they're as earnest and layered as always. And while I can hear a slight easing of the more obvious alternative country influences, bit of a shame in my book, the instrumentation does feel more lush and expansive in the strings and some of the horn sections. Not quite swiveling directly into Baroque pop territory, but definitely picking up a little bit more pomp and weight to it. What it does pick up from Baroque pop, though, is a certain sense of indulgence. Because while you can definitely make the argument there were experiments on this album that have nowhere close to the impact that they think they do. Take the opener, I Am All That, Arroyo Seco, Thumbprint Scar, which opens up with a very sparse, kind of poorly tuned guitar line and some borderline clumsy vocal harmonies, and yes, thankfully, it breaks off into a strings-accented acoustic groove with some subtle swells of deeper melody that all run through, but I can't be the only one who finds it a little bit jarring how often the song will just pivot back abruptly into bare-bones acoustics mid-groove, even if that main melodic motif does continue and evolve. Or take Merc Stoppa. I'm not really wild about the minor melody that touches off against some of the horns, but at least until we get to the electric guitar tone that fills in for any sort of hook. But then we get the outro, and yes, I get the melodies, they're layered in a round here. But normally, when you have a round, you have elements and notes that complement or harmonize with each other in the chord structures in each movement. And this just feels more like a pileup. It doesn't really get there. Or take 3rd of May, Odagara, a song that is intended to represent the tonal shifts and melodies that came over Fleet Fox's history and hiatus, a little bit of symbolism there. And not only is it very telling how the music representing their older work on the first half of the song sounds really phenomenal, But whenever Pecknold intentionally adds some slower moments of melancholy to shift up the mood, or that drawn-out, watery, droning end piece to capture a very uncertain future, they're elements that, yeah, they make sense artistically, but they lead to a composition that just doesn't hold the same power and an ending that loses all momentum for the last 3 minutes, which is not a good thing on a song that is nearly 9 minutes long. And that's before you get to songs like I Should See Memphis, where the ending just doesn't really go anywhere. Or the title track at the end of the album that piles on the horns for some grand finish, and then you end the song with 45 seconds of somebody running through a hall with very little overall payoff. I don't know, wasn't really an outro that worked for me. Now look, that's not saying that there aren't songs that have a little bit more of a conventional flow and structure. The deeper swell on the low end of the verses of Cassius, even if I don't really think the melody on the hook quite pays off the build-up, at least not until the violin cuts through on some of the bridge. Then you have Naiad's Cassidy's. It's got a little bit more of a refined, gentle sway to it, especially with the main guitar line and the piano on the bridge that I quite like. And it's clear songs like Kept Woman and If You Need Me, Keep Time on Me, or even Fool's Errand, they're calling back to a more established 60s folk melodic structure, yet, yeah, it really works for me. I like that a lot. And unlike most pieces, I think the transition between grooves on Another Ocean, January, June, it's actually pretty well done, even if, again, it never really hits a defined climax moment despite all of that buildup. But where this record abandons that for sudden slowdown moments or whiplash transitions, well look, I've heard some of this being described as calling back to more of a jazz approach in composition, but good jazz music plays with that tension to eventually find some form of release. And considering this record really doesn't build the momentum to any sort of dramatic climax, I can't help but feel a little bit underwhelmed by Pecknold just dipping into a very flat, very low monotone in some of his vocal arrangements and some of these slowdown points that's nowhere close to being as expressive. And that's before you get to I Should See Memphis, where it has that vocal tone is used for nearly the entire song, and I'm sorry, it doesn't really work for me. But fine. That can normally be excused if there is a certain poetry and flow to the writing. And I'll be the first to say that I really do like Pecknold's more literate and layered lyrics. There's always been a richness to a lot of the poetry that reads really well, even if you can't quite grasp the message on the first run through. Unfortunately, when you do start decoding what is being said on this album, it might have been an issue on previous Fleet Foxes albums that I just didn't pick up on it, but with the instrumentation and the harmonies that feel so much more scattered, the lyrics do come into sharper focus, and I cannot say I'm all that impressed. If you're looking for a broad, overarching theme, it circles back to a lot of expectations and choices. You know, that it's not all that it's cracked up to be. And from there we get a series of very loose pictures around it, from the complicated relationship that Pecknold has with some of his bandmates during that last tour and the recording of Helplessness Blues and then the accompanying hiatus, to some very political statements that really kind of fall flat for me. Now in the former case, I can at least appreciate that Pecknold acknowledges that he set up his own expectations, he blinded himself to other possibilities and his own emotions in some cases, and more often than not, only having himself to blame for creating that distance with his bandmates. Okay, sure, when he owns up to that responsibility, that can add to the melancholy, even on songs that are only thematically connected, on songs like Kept Woman or on I Should See Memphis, where each couplet is then subverted by the next one. I like that. But the problem in that song has in equalizing the choices that are made out to these expectations. They're all kind of on the same level playing field, the path taken, the path not, and that's not quite the case when you explicitly in that song draw parallels to the 2016 election, because you can be damn certain they were not the same choice. I know it was painted like that, but clearly in 2017, we know the difference. And yet, there's an odd detached form to these choices that will especially affect others that is all over this album, especially when you get a certain brand of underwritten armchair privilege, for lack of better words, that really bothers me, more because Pecknold really could have thought this through more. Take Naiad's Cassidy's, a song that's very plainly about society imposing strictures on women, but how is the final verse anything but more projection upon women? Or take Cassius, a song quite literally calling out how the system has betrayed black people in America, where he observes protests as a sympathetic observer, and yet I can't help but feel that it says a lot more that he chose not to involve himself, if only to stand as another voice against systemic injustices, because yeah, you really are so tamed because that's because you allowed yourself to be. And when you juxtapose the choices you regret that you've made because they've got direct consequences to you versus the choices you don't make because you think they don't ultimately matter when they actually do in the bigger picture, maybe more to other people than you, and yet they're framed on the same level without the self-awareness to call it out in the latter case, you get a major case of thematic dissonance. And for me, it really does a number on how much I enjoy this album. And yet it doesn't really surprise me, because the entire album feels kind of myopic, without that additional step outwards to see the bigger picture. And that can kind of work when you have intimate framing, but this record rarely, if ever, gets that close or raw, instead opting for more indulgent, grandiose production and arrangements that really don't hit that dramatic payoff for me. In short, the more I listen to this album, the less I liked it. It feels bloated and it really feels a little self-serving, leaving to a light 6 out of 10 for me and nothing more than a tentative recommendation. And yes, while I will admit the writing is tasteful and the harmonies can be beautiful, and the style of it all really can resonate with me. If you go even a little bit deeper, you'll find an album that gets frustrating in a hurry if you give it any sort of thought. And considering it took 6 years to get a new album from Fleet Foxes, for me, yeah, that's kind of disappointing. Gotta say it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this review will be a little bit controversial, but if you want to buy the record, links in the description below. And hey, I got the poll up there for all you guys to tell me how wrong I am. I know Fleet Foxes have a pretty die-hard fan base, and believe me, I wanted to like this. I love their self-titled album. I'm not as crazy about Helplessness Blues, but there's a lot there to it. But the more I went through this album, the more I get the feeling that these sort of records that are trying to be this political this quickly, it needed more thought. It needed to be a little bit more refined here, and it didn't come through properly. But hey, comments for you all tell me how wrong I am, and if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tiers you guys get to add records or even movies to that schedule. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.